This is a 25 marker from Edexcel Paper 3 for A-Level Economics. The question is, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors which are likely to determine the rate of economic growth in Germany relative to other developed economies. I'm going to give you a walkthrough of how I would answer this question. What I suggest is that you pause the video, have a look at the question yourself, come up with your own ideas, maybe even write out an answer, and then compare your answer to the one that I'm providing just to see how they match up, whether you're going in the right direction. And I've pulled from these extracts some information that I think is relevant. So I'm just going to sort of go through some of these extracts and point out what I think are some key points. So we're being asked to basically explain why we have the rate of economic growth that we do. So it's worth maybe looking at this figure 3, which is the annual percent change in real GDP for Germany and the average of developed countries. So we can see if we look sort of during this period from 2005 maybe to 2011, Germany is outperforming generally other economies. So Germany is this dark line. We've got maybe 3.9% growth here, which is all three of these years it's higher. We have a really hard year in 2008. I'm going to say 2009 because that's the year of the global financial crisis. So this makes sense. That's not really surprising. Nothing to do specifically with Germany. And then we've got these 2 years where we're outperforming again by quite a wide margin. We've got high levels of annual growth, and we can see over here we've got a period of much lower economic growth. And if you look more recently in sort of the 2020s, we are underperforming the average for developing economies, right? So we're trying to explain basically why we have maybe lower than expected growth despite what people normally consider a strong economy. And I'm also going to look at things like debt, right? So figure 1 here shows German economy budget balance. And so we can see there's a sort of deficit spending here as a percentage of GDP. But since 2014, we've had budget surpluses, right? And sort of peaking in 2018, we've got 1.9 percent of GDP as a surplus, which is a pretty big surplus. And kind of following that trend, we've got a decline in national debt as a percentage of GDP. So debt overall may still be increasing, but as a percentage of GDP, this is going down. And this maybe reflects decent levels of economic growth. Maybe sort of the growth of the economy is faster than the growth of the debt. And also that generally we're running a surplus, right? So that maybe means we're able to pay off some of the debt and the total burden is decreasing. So that means like we're being very cautious fiscally. And then in terms of information I've pulled out of here, I'll just go down to the notes I've got, which is the German unemployment has been steadily declining since 2005 to a current level of around 5%. So that's actually this data here. You can see the unemployment rate just going steadily down, right? And maybe this is an indication that the natural rate of unemployment is decreasing. We've also got German infrastructure is suffering from the decision to operate a balanced budget as growth has declined. Schools are crumbling in some regions, and Germany has an investment shortfall of 138 billion euros. So in terms of the two arguments I'm going to make, I'm going to focus probably on those two things. I'm going to focus on the investment shortfall in topic A, and I'm going to talk about low government spending on infrastructure in topic B. And so that I'm just going to copy in immediately as context for both of those. So I'm going to reference that in the application. And put the investment here. And I'm going to also probably in the application reference the growth has been positive. This stuff about like there being a budget surplus and our debt declining, I'm going to also put that as context for our second argument about like the poor spending on infrastructure, right? Because that's kind of the explanation for why there's been poor spending, is that we're operating these budget surpluses. And I might just mention the sort of decline in economic growth in topic A. So I've already put quite a bit of context in, just because I think I'm sort of providing arguments that are super directly responding to the stuff that they're telling me about in the extracts. In terms of sort of what we're doing for the low investment argument, like what the analysis is going to be, we're probably going to say that low levels of investment in the economy have led to lower AD because I is a component of AD, which is translated to lower rates of economic growth. just again to maybe focus a bit more in on the environment for this kind of low investment. Like, why is this likely to be happening in the economy? What's the explanation for this investment shortfall? I might say we might have poor government subsidies and programs to encourage investment, right? So maybe the government isn't operating schemes that encourage investment. Maybe something like a lower rate of unemployment, maybe less attractive for investors, and low growth may discourage investors. And that's going to lead to basically a vicious cycle where lower growth, how do I spell vicious? I don't know. Something like that. Yeah, so it creates a vicious cycle because low growth is the product of low investment, but then it also discourages investment. So there's kind of a multiplier effect that you see here, which would be maybe one of the things that you're mentioning in your definitions, which is like when you get investment, or an accelerator effect, right? Which is where you get investment and then that encourages growth, which in turn encourages investment. So I'm going to mention accelerator effect as one of the possible definitions. I might define the components of aggregate demand, so consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exchange rate, plus the export balance. I might, you could talk about aggregate supply. I'm probably going to talk more about aggregate supply when we do government spending on infrastructure. And then when it comes to the kind of diagram I could use here, I want to make sure I'm getting my micro in, because this is, normally I do sort of micro and macro, and low investment kind of spans both micro and macro. So I've got kind of options about the diagrams I could use. I could use this cost and revenue diagram, which I've done on a monopolistic competition. So I've shown sort of investment should result in declining average costs, because improvements in technology are going to save money for businesses. They're going to increase productivity. So maybe, this would also be something I'd include in the analysis. Maybe that's the explanation for low growth. And so I've illustrated, the fall in prices that comes. But I think the more critical part down here is this increase in output that comes as a result of technological investment and decreasing average and marginal costs. You can also see the increase in profit, which you can then argue also maybe provides more investment for the economy, where those profits are invested in innovation and research and development. So all things I would sort of use to strengthen the analysis I've already sort of started to outline. If I was using the diagram, that would be how I would interpret the diagram. The other thing you could do is to use this diagram, which is the ASAD diagram. It's a macro diagram. And again, we're saying, investment is a component of aggregate demand. So low investment means, we've got lower AD, right? So I'd be sort of saying this is maybe status quo. If we were in a world with higher investment, we'd have higher levels of growth, right? So I'm comparing AD1 is the sort of status quo in Germany, and LRAS1 is the status quo. And we could have these higher levels. So we're increasing aggregate demand because we're getting higher rates of investment, and that's a component of aggregate demand. And then we're getting increases in long-run aggregate supply if that investment, for example, is spent on things like infrastructure that are going to increase our capacity as an economy, right? Because investment affects aggregate demand, but it's also going to affect supply. It's going to affect long-run aggregate supply if we're educating people better, and therefore our workforce has higher skills, and so our long-run aggregate supply is going to be better, right? So both of these would work here. What I'm going to do, though, because my second point is about spending on infrastructure specifically, I'm going to save this first diagram for the sort of ASAD diagram. I'm going to save that for my second point, because I'd use basically the same diagram. And copy that over. So that's going to go here. Be smaller. And then I'm going to use this cost and revenue diagram for my current point. And that way I find one of the sort of things I want to make sure I'm doing with these paper 3 questions is using a macro and a micro diagram, because that's sort of a kind of a surefire way to make sure you're covering your bases in terms of doing both macro and micro. If I just use 2 macro diagrams, especially on this question, feels like I'm just writing a macro essay, right? So using this, focusing a bit more on driving down costs for businesses, so I'd sort of maybe want to reflect that a bit more in my analysis. I realize the way I've written this now is quite macro focused. So maybe if I'm doing this diagram, I talk about like, we're driving down costs for businesses, so higher rates of investment. So low rates of investment mean low improvements in technology. We fail to capture improvements in average cost and marginal cost, as shown by MC1 and AC2, which leads to fewer profit, lower output for firms, and lower profits, which in turn leads to less investment from businesses. So again, kind of a cycle going on, kind of an accelerator effect where, when businesses are able to take advantage of technology, they are able to capture more profits, and therefore they're able to reinvest more, so you get more investment in the economy. So both of these as lines of analysis work, but one is maybe a bit more micro-focused. And then in terms of my evaluation, let me think here. I'm also like, the purpose of the government subsidies bit is again to sort of focus a bit more on the micro components. So if I could go for a more subsidy focused angle and focus on like what kinds of policies are influencing this low rate of investment in the German economy. So I might say, low investment may also be a product of poor government spending as much as subsidies. For example, that could be one way I evaluate it, kind of tying it into my second point. I could talk about like, while there is an investment shortfall, this maybe has more to do with other factors like the health of import markets in the EU, right? Remember, Germany is a big exporter to other economies in the EU, so, poor growth of consumption in Spain and Portugal. I'm just picking those because they suffered a lot during the financial crisis and have a lot of government debt and low levels of consumption, lots of unemployment, might be hurting exports. So maybe another explanation for this is actually that difference in AD is more down to the health of the German exports than it is down to sort of levels of investment. That would be another way of evaluating this. And then we've got low government spending on infrastructure. So the analysis here is like lower spending on infrastructure means a lower level of LRAS, as LRAS is comprised of factors of production, of the capacity of production, i.e. the factors of production. And this then means there's a limit to economic growth. I'd also talk about like low government spending may explain a limit in AD. So again, kind of maybe more of a macro focus with the second point, as government spending is a component of aggregate demand. And then I'm referencing this sort of like the limitation of having a surplus, right? So that would be kind of the core of the analysis. I've got my diagram there. You want to be super clear if you're drawing it with the arrows this way, that like this represents what you could get if you had a higher rate of government spending on infrastructure and a higher rate of government spending in general. In terms of definitions, I want to define long-run aggregate supply, make it clear that it's influenced by factors of production. I could define components of aggregate demand, if that's not something I've touched on as much in my first point. I could think about the multiplier effect, right? So there's a few things you can go for there. In terms of evaluation here, I might say sort of while poor for infrastructure, a fiscal surplus may be key for attracting investment, given the current levels of investment are low. I might also say, like, another limitation of increased government spending, you might create the risk of inflation. And again, you can bring in a bit of outside context if you're aware of it, which is like, especially given this was I think this is a 2020 paper, right? So, we are maybe starting, I guess by that point, not so much inflation, but if you got the question now, you could say, especially given the current levels of inflation are high globally, so more government spending is probably going to exacerbate those issues, right? So that's another thing you could write. In terms of judgment, you sort of want to come down on maybe which of these you think is the more key problem in the economy. So I'm going to say the key issue is a low rate of government spending, which could explain the low rates of growth, while a shortfall in infrastructure is an issue, in investment is an issue. This likely has more to do with falling rates of consumption elsewhere. This means that Germany needs to boost its own domestic consumption with a more expansionary fiscal policy. So, like, what I'm basically saying here is bringing together the arguments I've already made. If the issue that we have is, per my evaluation for the first point, that maybe there's declining consumption in other countries within the European Union, the solution to that problem isn't necessarily going to be more investment or more technological improvements. It's going to be trying to find consumption within the German economy through more government spending, right? We need German people to be buying German products if people in Spain and Portugal are not going to be able to buy them at the same rates that they previously were. And that's sort of kind of the judgment for like why that might be the most important thing. Obviously, there's other ways you could frame this. You could definitely argue on the basis of like there being a high risk of inflation at the moment, that government spending is probably not the smartest way to solve this problem. It's not probably the primary cause of these issues. If anything, it might be an explanation for why, maybe Germany, I don't know whether this is true, but maybe they have a lower rate of inflation because they have a more balanced budget. And that might be a good thing for the economy generally, right? So that's not maybe the main issue. That would be another way of framing this, kind of flipping it. You're always going to have a lot of like latitude to come up with whatever answer you think is suitable, provided you can justify that answer. So I'm super curious to hear what you guys came up with in response to this question. If you comment it below, I'll have a look and we can sort of talk through those answers.